Now that AI is all the rage, I thought, can it replace me? Do I even need to be here? Can I just ask ChatGPT, hey dude, what do you recommend for passive budget bookshelf speakers? Let's see what it has to say. Before we go down this rabbit hole, let's consider one thing that's very important. AI is built upon whatever is out there available to it. So in the world of the internet, when you ping ChatGPT for a question, it goes and scours the internet and it looks for certain things and it comes back to you with an answer. Therefore, the answers that we're going to get are based on whatever is out there on the internet, whether it be from you, the consumer, who has posted a review maybe on Amazon or some other website or some other forum, or other reviewers who have a website dedicated to their cause. The information is just bundled up and packaged and provided to you. It's not ChatGPT's fault if it gets something wrong. It's actually ours, myself, other reviewers, yours. So with that in mind, let's scour the internet and find out what, pray tell, might ChatGPT and AI tell us to buy with our budget money. Simple question. What are the best budget passive bookshelf speakers? ChatGPT comes back and gives me a list. Q Acoustics 3020i, Wharfdale 220, Polk Audio S15, Klipsch R41M, and Elac's Debut 5.2. So we're going to just step through these one by one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare this description with actual data, objective, quantifiable data that is captured either by myself or other reviewers. And then it has been shared onto Pierre Albert's, sorry, Pierre, if I'm messing your name up here, SPINORAMA.org website. And what Pierre does is he takes my raw data, he takes other outlets' raw data or digitizes sample data, and then he goes and applies it and puts it on his website. And the format is easy to compare between different sources. That's why I'm going to use that source for today's video. This data allows us to look at three main things. One is the on-axis response. You want a speaker that's neutral out of the box. You don't want a speaker that's colored, that has its own resonances and that impart any sort of tonal characteristics on the sound. Basically, you want to be able to take a recording of whatever it is that you like and play it back on a system that does not alter the sound. That's the ideal reference. And if you have a flat response, that means the on-axis response is going to be true to the source. You'll never really have a perfectly flat one, but you can get pretty close. The on-axis response is covered in the blue line as we see here. The red line is the early reflections, and you can look at that and kind of get an idea of the tonality of the speaker once it's placed into a room. It's close to an estimated in-room response. It's not the same thing, but it's close. In doing so, we can say, yeah, this speaker may not have enough bass, or the treble may be too high, or there may be a resonance here or there. The other line we want to pay attention to is the green line at the bottom. The more linear this line is, the more it means that we can equalize the speaker to our tastes. So while you may not have a perfectly flat on-axis response, if the green line down here at the bottom is linear, not necessarily flat, but linear, then we should be able to equalize the response and smooth out some of the trouble areas. And that's really how you're able to identify good value options. Because frankly, if you're spending a little bit of money, you're probably not going to get a flat on-axis response. Normally, you have to spend a good deal more money to get more close to an ideal flat on-axis response. But if you have equalization like so many of us do for our home theaters, then you can equalize that non-flat response and make it sound better overall. We're going to start with the Q Acoustics 3020i. These speakers retail for about $450 a pair, and here is the data. My takeaway from this graphic is that this speaker has some sort of resonances going on in the 1 to 2 kilohertz area, and that's going to make it sound rather tinny sounding. There's also a little bit of a dip in the crossover region, which is going to take away some of the presence or maybe some of the detail of this particular speaker in your room. Now, if we go down here and look, we can see that the early reflections indicate that there's a pretty big difference between the mid-range area and the upper mid-range treble area. This indicates that this speaker is going to sound rather bright in the room. Can we equalize that out? Let's go look. Because this green line isn't flat and it doesn't continue to make a slope in this general direction, this particular area is going to be hard to equalize. And that means we're not going to be able to equalize out entirely the high frequency area that's going to be problematic. So In my opinion, looking at this data, I would say this speaker probably isn't that great. It could be a lot worse, but there are some attributes about it that I'm going to find problematic in my room. Next speaker, the Elac B 5.2. This is a speaker that I've actually tested myself and I've heard myself, so I can make a testify. I can qualify my statements. Good Lord, I don't know what I'm saying. Basically, what I'm about to tell you about how I think the speaker is going to sound, I can back up because I actually listened to it and I've reviewed it. So the on-axis response looks pretty good initially, but then you see, oh, there's a pretty big difference between about 1 to 2 kilohertz. And it's about a delta of about maybe 2 dB or so. There's a 2 dB swing between the mid-range and the upper mid-range. That's going to make the speaker sound rather forward. How do I know that? Well, the data's showing me that, and I've also heard the speaker. The other aspect about the speaker that I know is going to sound rather forward is by looking at the early reflections. Now, the early reflections peaking starts at around 2 kilohertz or so, and then tapers off as you go higher in frequency. That's going to sound like a forward-sounding speaker, basically because the high frequency is higher in level than the mid and the lower frequencies. Can we equalize that out? Well, if we go through here, this particular area is going to be a little bit harder to equalize out. But above 2 kilohertz, that high frequency area where it's tilted up more, yes, we can knock that down. And that's actually what I found to be the case when I reviewed this speaker. So this is a pretty good speaker if you're going to have equalization. The Wharfedale Diamond 220, not really a great speaker. Number one, the bass just really isn't there. At about $250 a pair or so, depending on when and where you buy it, one could almost live without a lot of bass. You would just supplement it with a subwoofer. But the problem for me is that you have to cross that subwoofer so relatively high, and I'm talking at least 100, 120 hertz, if not a little bit higher, that it kind of takes away the point of having this particular speaker. I mean, at that point, just look at other speakers. A couple other things. Standard resonance around 1 kilohertz. All of these speakers are roughly the same size, and there's going to be 2 typical issues that we're going to see with speakers in this budget category and of the bookshelf size. Normally, it's going to be a standard port resonance or an enclosure resonance of around 1 to 2 kilohertz. That's going to make this speaker sound very bright at certain frequencies, depending on if your music hits that resonance. Now, music is a series of tones. That's just basically what it is. So if your music happens to hit that particular tone, it's going to light that box up. You're going to hear that tone. You're going to hear that as resonance. And it may go from sounding like I'm talking like this to I'm talking like this. It's going to resonate. It's going to give it more vibrato. You don't want a speaker to do that. Looking at the early reflections, we can also see that there's a dip in this crossover area. Again, it's going to sound a little bit higher in output in the higher frequencies, and it's going to sound rather mellow in that crossover region. Now, some people like about a 2 to 3 dB dip between 1 to 3 kilohertz. Some manufacturers designed that. They want that in there. In the case of Wharfedale, I'm going to assume that they probably did design it that way because I've seen and I've heard that they do that in their other speakers. That said, it's not a particular sound that I want. I can live with it, but it's not a sound that I want. So can you EQ that to make it a more neutral speaker? Let's see. So can we EQ this peak out? Yeah, you can EQ that peak out. It's kind of linear through there. Can you EQ out this dip through here? Nope, because you're going from linear right here to swinging back around. So basically your pattern of radiation in that midwoofer is tightening up as it plays higher in frequency. And then all of a sudden you've got your tweeter playing, and your tweeter is playing very wide. So there's a mismatch in the dispersion of the speaker. The speaker is playing very narrow at around 2 kilohertz because that's where the woofer is beaming. And then the tweeter comes in at around 3 kilohertz. The tweeter is very wide. There's a mismatch in the sound that's being directed out into your room. You're not really concerned about what's playing directly on axis at that point. You care about what's going out into the room, bouncing off the sidewalls and coming back to you. And if there's any difference between those signals, you're going to pick that up as a timbre difference. So overall, the Wharfedale Diamond 220, probably not a speaker I would recommend. Next up, we have the Polk S15, and it retails at about $250 per pair. And here we have the data. Again, another speaker that looks pretty reasonable on axis, but we see the standard resonance type issues at around, this one's 900 hertz, but they're around 1 kilohertz. There's also a dip in the 2 to 3 to 4 kilohertz region, followed by peaking on axis around 10 to 11 kilohertz. And if we go and look at the early reflections, again, we're seeing the same thing that we saw with many other speakers where it's going to sound bright because the in-room response is going to be a culmination of direct sound and reflected sound. And the sound that's radiated from the mid-range in this 1 to 3 kilohertz region is more narrow than the sound that's radiated from the tweeter in that same particular region, around 3 kilohertz or so. So your tweeter's wide, your mid-range is narrow, you're going to have an imbalance of reflection. Therefore, in room, this speaker is going to sound bright. The next one up is the Klipsch R41M at about $130 per pair. This is, I believe, the most nonlinear speaker in this particular group. I believe it's also close to the cheapest one, if not the cheapest one. So we see a few things that are typical. Ringing around 1 kilohertz, port resonance and or enclosure resonances. Take your pick, doesn't matter. It's very annoying. And this particular one is a lot higher than some of the other ones we looked at about 3.5 dB over the linear line, if you just wanted to kind of draw a line through here. We also have peaking going on around 2.5 kilohertz. You have a dip in this 3 kilohertz area, and then you have a boosted high frequency. That 1 kilohertz resonance is going to sound edgy and resonant. The dip in that 3 to 4 kilohertz area is going to make this speaker sound dull in that particular area. But the high frequency boost is also going to make this thing sound bright. So you've got a lot of things going on with this particular speaker, and basically it's just not a neutral speaker. Out of all the speakers that ChatGPT gave me, the only one that I think I could recommend if you're using equalization would be the Elac B 5.2. If you're not using equalization though, I still don't think I could recommend this speaker, which leaves me with the obvious question of what do I recommend then? If you're looking for something in this budget range of say maybe under $500, what would I recommend? Well, let's see. The absolute easiest one for me to tell you, Emotiva's B1 Plus. That is the most neutral bookshelf speaker I've tested to date. It's my go-to recommendation for anyone on a budget. And the budget is actually pretty good. It's about $280, $380 right now. They're currently not in stock. I think their current price is $380, but that price seems to kind of shift around depending on when they have a sale or when they don't. I would love if they would put it back to the standard price of either $250 or $300. I can't remember where it was when I reviewed it. But even at $380, I don't think the speaker can be beat. And it still represents, in my opinion at least, and it's kind of backed up by the data, the best value. Let's look at the data real fast. We can see that this particular speaker is mostly neutral on axis. There is a similar thing that the Elac had where there's a bit of a discrepancy between the mid-range and the upper mid-range, and that happens to be at around 100 hertz. I don't know if that's a baffle step issue or not, but luckily it's only about 1 dB or so swing, so it's not terrible. And the really cool thing about that is down here, look how smooth this is, this particular area. If you've got equalization, a single shell filter will flatten that right out. You'll be good to go. Aside from that, however, you still have good early reflections. So the early reflections indicates to me that the speaker is going to sound pretty good in the room. And to my ears, it does. The only issue I have with seeing this data and trying to recall from memory what I thought about it was the high frequency area is boosted about 2 dB to 3 dB. You're probably going to want to tame that down some. Another suggestion would be the Polk XT20. It's a smaller bookshelf speaker, costs about $300 per pair, and it's ones that I bought myself to review a couple years ago. While it isn't the best speaker in the world, I think it also represents a good value. The on-axis response also looks good, but we see the same thing that we see with other speakers, where there's a discrepancy between the mid frequency and the upper mid frequency. That happens to be around 700 hertz in this particular case, and the delta is at about, let's see, 0.8. So it's about 2 dB swing, give or take. Can you equalize that out? Yep, you can equalize that out. Not really a problem. Early reflections looks pretty good too. However, notice how there is a peaking in the high frequency in the on-axis response and the early reflections response. I definitely heard that, and that was my #1 complaint with all of the Polk XT series speakers. They all sounded too bright. You can try towing them out, turning them a little off axis so where they're not facing directly at you, but pointed out into the room by maybe 10, 20, 30 degrees even, and see if you can alleviate that. But what I think is going to work best is some simple equalization there or some sidewall treatment to help capture that excess energy in the treble that's bouncing off the sidewalls and coming back to you. And maybe 1/2 inch thick, 1 inch thick, nothing more than that. But I still recommend going with one of the other speakers that I suggested, the $300 Polk XT20 or the 300 and something whatever dollar Emotiva B1 Plus, to me, those represent better values and better alternatives for bookshelf speakers on a budget. So let me know in the comments what you think. Do you agree with ChatGPT? Do you agree with me? Do you think we're both wrong? And what do you suggest on a $500 or less budget for a passive bookshelf speaker? I'd be really curious to know what you think and what your suggestions are. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's kind of fun seeing what the options are that are out there and evaluating them from an objective standpoint and looking at the measurements to understand what you're probably going to hear, and also basing that on what I heard with some of the speakers that I've reviewed myself. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. I want to thank you all for your time and hope you learned something. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I will talk to you all later.